Welcome to Difficult Dialogues, Voices from the Valley. I'm Lynn Pasquerella, president of Mount Holyoke College. Difficult Dialogues is intended to bring to bear voices from the Valley on some of the most complex social issues of the day at the forefront of public discussion and private debate. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Professor David Hernandez. David is an assistant professor of Latino, Latin American, Spanish studies at Mount Holyoke College. He's been doing research recently on some of the ethical and social issues around detention of undocumented immigrants. So, David, thank you for joining us. Let's start by talking about your research. Tell us what you have learned about the scope of the problem of detention of undocumented immigrants in the United States.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for the invitation to be here this afternoon. Detention in the my research surrounds the institution of detention of immigrants, that is, the incarceration of non-citizens pursuant to their removal from the United States. A lot of people might, I think for a lot of citizens of the United States and people who live here, they know detention from 9/11. That's where the word really came up, and we see it in terms of Guantanamo detainees, but really what that overshadows is that we've been detaining people and deporting people from this country since the beginning. And the Bureau of Immigration began in the 1890s, and there's been a constant consolidation of power to do this to non-citizens for well over 100 years. So the history is very long, but I think people's memories are very short when it comes to knowing the issue.
So what sort of people are being detained? What are the circumstances under which they are brought in?
Persons who are detained, they're detained if pursuant to their removal from the United States. So primarily that could be undocumented persons who are here, either they overstay their visas or they entered without inspection. They became undocumented while they were here. Legal permanent residents are detained, that is green card holders. I think this is something that people don't know. And so of the people that are deported every year, the average length of time they've lived in the United States has been over 10 years. And so these are not persons who just crossed the border yesterday. These are long-term residents of our communities, parents, churchgoers, these are the people that have been in the United States for a very long time.
And for how long are they detained?
One can be detained for as short as a day, a few hours, weeks, to years. So there's a category of detainees that were popularly called amongst advocates lifers, meaning that they were held because they could not be removed from the country. Maybe we couldn't get documents to remove them to Cuba or to Vietnam or to China, and so they just remain in detention day in and day out. And it's not a sentence. There's no end date. It's just the end date is when they can be removed. And so there's still people that have been in detention for 8, 9 years at a time.
One of the challenges is, of course, because they are not considered U.S. citizens, they don't have that legal right to representation. So what recourse do they have?
That's probably one of the largest issues, that they're not citizens. If a non-citizen commits a crime, he or she will have a right to a lawyer, actually. But if they're in deportation proceedings, there is no guaranteed right, at least for paid counsel by the U.S. government. So what that means is that for every one person that has a lawyer in deportation proceedings, about 8 or 9 do not, which affects their success rate in a huge way. And so the main reason they don't have access to an attorney is because detention and deportation fall under administrative powers. And so it's not considered, it's not under the criminal justice system. And so there's none of the guarantees that would benefit someone who committed a crime, robbing a bank, killing someone. That person will get a lawyer. They have access to a speedy trial. They might have a bond hearing. They might have Miranda rights. None of that is granted to, automatically at least, to immigrant detainees.
I know that there are some attorneys who have taken that upon themselves to be advocates for people who are in detention who don't have access to advocacy. So are those lobbying groups becoming more visible with respect to the plight of undocumented immigrants?
I mean, they're probably the most important legal players. You have a lot of faith-based organizations, Catholic charities, Lutheran groups. They provide lawyers to a lot of immigrants. The ACLU, the Center for there's legal advocacy groups in New York, a lot of them. They provide advocacy, but they're the lifeline. And so you need to have a sympathetic case. You need to have access to them. And if you're detained somewhere in the middle of Iowa and you don't know where the lawyers are, you might not have any access. So, and there might not be any lawyers that are trained in immigration law within 50 miles of where you're held.
What's the impact on the families of those who are detained?
That's probably the biggest. When people talk about detention, deportation, one of the first things you're going to hear is family breakup. We're breaking up families, and there's no doubt about that. And so many immigrants in the United States, we often think that we have immigrants on this side of the room and citizens on the other side of the room, but actually families are mixed between both quite often. And so the impact is great on families. It affects citizens as well. 4 million children today have at least one undocumented parent, so their family is prone to family breakup quite easily. And so if you deport a breadwinner, that could lead to financial ruin for the entire family. And so it happens every day. And so a lot of people might think, well, you have children in the United States, they're not going to deport you, but it's not the case at all. We deport people all the time. Even so, to the point where it's estimated that some 5,000 children are in foster care because of the detention and/or the deportation of their parents.
What's the relationship of this problem to the DREAM Act? To the
DREAM Act. The DREAM Act is a form of relief for young persons who grew up here most of their lives, and they fulfilled certain criteria like going to college or potentially serving in the military, and they're considered. There is no DREAM Act yet. It's just a proposal. But were that to pass, some of these persons would have access to a sort of legalization process. The idea they've been here so long, they grew up here, they're like Americans. That's the idea. President Obama deferred the deportation of persons that might in the future qualify for such an act. And so that can seem like a great thing. It was a lot of people talked about maybe it was an election, maybe it was a political calculation. And so there's a lot of young people, students of ours today, that benefited from that. But what it also represents is a sort of carving up the issue, taking a very sympathetic population and granting them rights, at least, or relief, really, from deportation. But what it doesn't do, what about their parents? Their parents don't have that relief. And so it continues to carve up the community with these persons that have rights and these other persons who have, in some ways, at least in relief to those persons, even less.
Mm. There are some states like Arizona that have made a push against ethnic studies, have really tried to push back against immigration reform. There is a political, cultural climate in the United States that can be brought to bear on these issues. How would you articulate in a compelling way why Americans should be concerned about this issue?
Basically, we're harming families. I mean, one of the things we talk about is scale. There's 34,000 people in detention today, and they'll be there tomorrow and the next day. In terms of that leads up to 400,000 persons detained annually, and about the same amount, not necessarily the same people, 400,000 persons deported per year. That's a large number. You compare that to what's called the prison industrial complex, the system of jails and prisons in the United States. That's 2.5 million people. So in many ways, it's much smaller. But if you think about those people who potentially could be deported, we have 11 million people that could be deported any day. We have another 10, 12 million green card holders that if they were to commit a deportable crime or overstay their visa or somehow break the rules of their residency, they could be deported. We have another 25 million non-immigrants, student visas, temporary workers. All of them, if they were to break the rules of their visa or commit a deportable crime, they could be deported. So the scale is actually much larger than we think about. And so I think the big issue is that when you have a population of persons with dramatically less rights than everyone else, it leads to exploitation in the workplace, it leads to exploitation within the family in terms of abusive spouses, it leads to exploitation by the police, and so we've created this huge population through our immigration laws.
The Republican Party has recently come out against some of the practices that we have in the prison industrial complex, saying that perhaps we should step back and reverse our three-time loser laws, the three strikes laws that have said if you commit 3 crimes, then you're in prison for life. Some of those harsh retributivist approaches that we have taken, it seems to be driven in large part by economics, that we can't afford to incarcerate these large numbers of individuals. To what extent are our policies around immigration driven by economics?
I think it's the same thing. I was at an event last year put on by, I think, Human Rights First, and some of the speakers, actually one of the main speakers, arguing for, in this case, providing counsel, providing bail and bond, providing alternatives to detention, like wearing ankle bracelets. And but the main argument behind it was financial, that it would save money. So it wasn't about human rights or stigma or breaking up families. It was about saving money. And one of the main speakers was, interestingly enough, Grover Norquist was there, the anti-tax libertarian, and he made the argument. So clearly these groups were trying to reach across the aisle to gain broader support and to get relief for people right now. But it's not really driven by, I would argue it's not really driven by human concerns, but by financial ones and economic ones.
Was there anything surprising in the research that you did?
There are surprises. One of the ways, private detention, the use of for-profit prisons in the detention process is very large. In prisons today, in prisons and jails, criminal prisons, maybe I think 5–7% of those beds that hold people are by private prisons. But that's 7% of 2.5 million, so that's quite a bit. In immigrant detention, almost half of the bed space is managed or run by or owned by for-profit companies, and so they have a big stake. They lobby very hard for harsh legislations like the legislation in Arizona that you mentioned that leads to these deportations. And even just today, I was reading some articles about this topic. And the GEO Group is one of these large worldwide prison companies. They also make ankle bracelets. So if we do move towards providing people ankle bracelets, which are highly stigmatic as well, you have to wear this, you have to plug yourself into a wall, you can never take it off. They make them too. So if they can't keep someone in jail, they get to slap the bracelet on them and still profit.
I think there's a perception that it's conservative administrations who are really pushing this hard line against immigrants who are undocumented, but in fact the Obama administration, more so-called liberal administrations, have really placed severe restrictions on the rights of immigrant populations. Can you talk about this kind of bipartisan perspective with respect to immigration reform?
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, being tough on crime, being tough on terrorism, being tough on immigrants pays off handsomely at the voting booth for all parties. And so traditionally, all groups have been, President Obama is no different. He's more efficient, he's deporting more people, he's also created certain forms of relief. So he's playing both sides. George Bush did this. Bill Clinton signed some of the worst immigration legislation of all time in 1996 that basically created the legal infrastructure for a massive expansion of detention and deportation. And so both parties benefit. In the mid-90s, a very anti-immigrant period. It was the Congressional Hispanic Caucus which okayed the militarization of the border, but even though they were against reducing legal avenues for entry, but they were okay with and voted all the time with putting more boots on the ground along the border, building fences. And so which is why we have any consideration of comprehensive immigration reform today, usually from both parties, has a very strict enforcement aspect to it. And it pays, and again, it's political currency. It's driven by that.
There's a good deal of rhetoric in the United States about protecting human rights on the global level. How does the world view us in relation to the way that we treat immigrant populations?
I mean, I think there's other countries are harsher. Other countries are partners in our process. Mexico, a lot of people migrate through Mexico to come to the United States. We put a lot of pressure on them to have stricter enforcement. And this goes back in time. When we had anti-Chinese laws in the United States, so did Canada. When we interned Japanese, so did Canada and Australia. So we have international partners, and so, but the U.S., it's very to argue for human rights and to argue for supranational organizations like the UN and their rules and their regulations. The U.S. is actually above those and can shrug that off. and we've done it in the past. At the same time, human rights discourse and rules and concepts do slip into the process, and there is a movement in the 1980s when there were the wars in Central America and we were returning people to death squads. A lot of very powerful activists moved the issue into the area of human rights with a lot of success.
Are you optimistic with respect to the proposed immigration reform?
That's a tough question. I'm optimistic for some families that are already here. I think some people will benefit and will gain some sort of regularization or amnesty or whatever they're going to call it. But in even the most positive form, the Senate's bill right now, it's estimated that most of the 11 million undocumented, some 40% won't even qualify. And so we're still going to have a very, very large population of people with less rights. And those people that do get removed, because they're long-term residents, because they have families, because they have homes, because they have businesses, they're going to keep returning. And so the flow back to the United States isn't a new undocumented immigrant. It's an old person returning home. And so that's what's different about the population today. So I hope it changes, but I don't see it. I don't see it.
If you were invited by the current administration to offer policy recommendations, what would you recommend?
I would say close down these detention centers. There's no need. Decriminalize the whole process. I would also suggest that we provide as much due process as possible up front. Why wait for an attorney with the help, a detainee with the help of the ACLU to make it to the Supreme Court? Why not provide that lawyer at the beginning? Why not provide bond at the beginning? Why not have a robust defense to lower this process? And why not consider proportionality? You know, that if you steal someone's iPhone, that your whole family is going to be destroyed. Why not? We should measure the effect of deportation against the so-called crime.
So these models of restorative justice haven't been popular in the United States, but as we bring attention to the plight of marginalized communities, is there a way to get community activism engagement to move more toward a restorative justice approach if there is some disruption in the equilibrium due to an offense by someone who is undocumented? Can we take a less extreme approach?
I think we absolutely can. One thing is, if they've committed a deportable crime, is to, again, consider the proportionality of that crime. Most of these persons served time, and so they paid their dues. They are done with the crime, but that crime can lead to their deportation as well. And because it's administrative, there's no sense of double jeopardy and that being unfair. It just makes them undesirable. And so we need to sort of consider the measure of that crime and the sentence, and that they've paid their dues to society, and that they're productive now. And to go back in time for crimes that might not even be crimes when they committed them, and now they're deportable today, there's something very wrong about that.
Are there mechanisms for outreach and education of the populations that you're advocating for?
I think that comes mostly from immigrant rights groups, from young people, the DREAM Act students. Right now there is an organization called the National Immigrant Youth Alliance. They have already put themselves in deportation proceedings and infiltrated detention centers themselves. Very bold actions. Some people criticize those actions. But they've changed the terms of the debate, and at the same time you have hunger strikes and detention centers in Tacoma and near Seattle. Today, this week, you have persons entering the border, asking to be let in and claiming asylum from Mexico, and going into detention, and then organizing the detainees from within, especially against the harsh conditions. And so, I think it's become we know more about it today, and it's young people that are driving the issue.
It hasn't been uncommon in the United States for children of immigrants to be advocates for their parents under the most adverse circumstances, and I do worry about the kind of pressure that's put on children who have multiple responsibilities, especially when they're separated from their parents under certain circumstances. Are there school programs that are designed to help children who might be in this position?
Not in a direct way in the United States. I mean, I think that people are concerned about children. And children do a lot of work already in any immigrant family. They translate, they sign things, they talk to officials for their parents, and so they already do this. And they also carry they carry the burden when their parents are deported, or at least are afraid to be deported. I have heard of a program. One of our students at Mount Holyoke found some, for children that are deported with their parents to Mexico, that the school systems in Mexico have created integration programs on how to integrate these, a lot of them U.S. citizens, into the Mexican school system. And so in the U.S., not so much. I mean, I think maybe scholarships and in-state tuition for DREAM Act eligible students, that's so far is the best we've seen.
Are these issues getting enough attention in curricula in higher education?
People teach the issue in immigration classes. I teach the issue. I teach a history of deportation class, and we discuss the issue. Other scholars do the same. I think the activism is very impressive, and people who teach social movements use immigration, immigrant activists in labor and also in anti-deportation movements as part of curriculum, and it's very exciting. It tells us a lot about the nation, about our legal structure, so there's much to be learned from studying it.
And how is the media framing the issue?
I think the media looks for sensational stories, and whether they be innocents that are hurt by the system, or very bad people that abuse the system, and so it's very polarized. And oftentimes it's the advocates that are part of that too. You present the valuable assets of this innocent person and show why the government's harming them, and that can be. It's a great way to motivate people, to get people involved, to raise money. But at the same time, sometimes when you argue the innocence of one, you underscore the guiltiness of the other, and it doesn't always change. It doesn't often change it. Sometimes it harms the idea. And probably the largest issue to think about is just in terms of the term illegal that we use, and illegal in some sort of quotation marks, because it's not a legal term. It's a popular term, but it's passed around as if it has legal meaning, and it doesn't. And but the media runs with that term.
Yes, just the use of that term is an othering of a group of individuals that we have as members of our community and who contribute in significant ways. Mm-hmm. What are the takeaways from your book when it comes out and we read it? What do you want us to go home and think about after we've finished reading in a library?
Well, I hope we know. Probably one of the things I push the most is that this is a long-term process, that it's not new. It's not just since the 1990s. It's not just since September 11, 2001, that we've been utilizing this institution and this form of punishment to harm people from the beginning. And there's the people that are removed through the process, but there's also those that remain and that are afraid of that process, and they become docile laborers. And again, they are highly exploitable, and their marginality is part of the equation. I think I would argue that it's deliberate, and that when you have these lesser persons in society, whether they be non-citizens or whether they be, in the past we had slaves or Native Americans, persons with less rights, that it's very productive and very profitable. And I would hope that we would see that as part of the larger issue as well.
And how do we get our legislators to pay attention to these issues as critical issues to address? They are lobbied all the time.
I think one of the things they do, people try to humanize the detainee, to decriminalize them, to remove the term illegal from them. Immigrants are often talked about as abstractions, as criminals without a name, when we don't even know what the crime is, when we don't even know what the offense is, and oftentimes there isn't an offense. And so I think humanizing the issue, revealing the issue is very important, because it's very obscured, and that's one of the things to push the legislatures. But also that legislatures listen to voters, and immigrants don't vote, and so it has to be those citizen children, those faith-based groups, those average people that care about inequality. They have to push the legislation.
Are there obstacles that are created in times of an economic downturn or in times of war? What are the larger social factors that might come into play in determining whether we're going to get legislators who are willing to advocate for immigrant populations?
That's a very important question, because if the issue is framed as a sensational issue, as a national crisis, that is when government has its most power. that as citizens we often offer our government a blank check to do what it needs to do in this emergency situation. And so a lot of it is confronting that sensationalism and realizing that when you expand the ability and the powers of the government to detain and deport people because of a terrible event like 9/11, that you're really going to, the real impact is going to be on this large population of immigrants. And so we have to battle that. When we talk about a war on terror or a war on crime or any kind of war, military or not, we have to scale that discourse back, because that kind of martial rhetoric is what generates resources for people to advance this process. And once you build a prison, it begets another prison. They don't tear them down very often. A county jail becomes a detention center. A detention center becomes a youth detention facility. You know, and so we have to sort of remove some of the infrastructure as well.
There was an article recently by Nicholas Kristof about how academics have a responsibility to play the role of public intellectuals. In what ways do you use your research, your scholarship, your teaching to encourage students, to inspire students to make a difference in the world?
I mean, what I tell students is when they graduate or when they get excited about an issue is, one, to do more research, you know, to dig deeper into something that we haven't discovered yet, but also to, once they have these intellectual powers, to use them for good, you know, to go out there and make some change. And they can be on multiple sides of the issue, but even if they're not going to become a political activist, or they're not going to go on to become an attorney that supports immigrants, to at least engage the issue and change the discourse. And that's where they have a lot of power. They're the creators of new trends and new ways of speaking, and they can help remove some of the very damaging ones, like the term illegal, like the notion that all immigrants are criminals. And they go out into the world and speak and talk and write, and that's what's exciting. I think hopefully they just engage with the issue.
Well, you are certainly an extraordinary example of a public intellectual, and we're deeply grateful for all of your contributions to Mount Holyoke and to the Valley. David Hernandez, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lynn. Appreciate it.